The Supreme Court session wraps up next week, and there are still pivotal cases on the docket that have not yet been ruled on. That includes political gerrymandering cases in Maryland and North Carolina, as well as a controversial case that will decide whether or not the census can ask about citizenship. Now, that census case could have a major impact on future elections, as the number of congressional seats and, as a result, electoral votes could be affected. I recently sat down with Washington Post reporter Tara Bahrampour to help hash it out. Tara, on the census citizenship question, the case is now before the Supreme Court, but there's been new information in the case since the court heard the arguments. Remind our viewers what that new information is, how it could impact the facts in the case as well.
Correct. There have been several developments. A couple of weeks ago, it came out that a Republican redistricting strategist who died last year had some files that his daughter accidentally found on some hard drives in his house that showed that he had put together a study in 2015 that showed the impacts of a citizenship question and showed that it would be disproportionately beneficial to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites and detrimental to Democrats and people of color. So that was one big sort of bombshell that came out after the Supreme Court already had the case and had heard argument. And then a few days ago, it turned out that that strategist, Thomas Hoffler, had also been in touch via private email with a census official who was pretty high up and is still there in the Bureau.
Does the Supreme Court, has they heard this new information? Will it be a factor in their decision?
It's unclear whether it will be a factor, but they've certainly heard it, and several of the lawyers for the plaintiffs in these trials against the question, challenging the question, have requested several things from the Supreme Court. The ACLU lawyers requested that they hold off on making a decision based on the new evidence, and then the Maryland trial, in which the judge had ruled against the question on the basis of the Administrative Procedure Act, but had not found that there was enough evidence to show that the government had conspired or intended to discriminate. They're asking that judge to look at that again, and so they are hoping that the Supreme Court will take that into account as well.
And I understood that there was a judge who had delayed a ruling pending the Supreme Court's decision about that new information. If the Supreme Court rules and allows the question on the census, and it seemed to lean that way during oral arguments, could the lower court revisit the issue after the Supreme Court rules?
So Judge Furman in New York, and this is one of 3 federal judges who have ruled against the question, in a hearing a couple of weeks ago, based, on this new information, he called a hearing, and he said he can't just jump in and rule without having a more formal procedure. And so he is going to look at it later in the summer. The problem with this is that the Supreme Court was asked to expedite their ruling because the census the census forms are going to be sent to the printer in July. And so they agreed to come up with a ruling this month. And now that all this new information has surfaced, it could be a problem if more information comes out that causes these courts to find further issues, beyond what the Supreme Court is currently considering.
What was the rationale given by the Justice Department for adding the citizenship question, and have they responded to the new information that just came to light in the past few months?
So it's actually the Commerce Department, it's Secretary Wilbur Ross, who last March of 2018 decided to add the question. And he told Congress at the time that that decision was based on and was a response to a request that came from the Justice Department in December of 2017 asking for a citizenship question to be added. Now, in the lawsuits, in the documents that came out in the lawsuits, it transpired that actually there had been conversations between Secretary Ross and several White House and Republican operatives and advisors, for example, Stephen Bannon and Chris Kobach, going early into the Trump administration. And with these Hoffler files, it turns out that these discussions even predated the Trump administration.
Tara, most people probably assume that adding a citizenship question to the census will help Republicans since it will depress Hispanic responses. Does the new information speak to that or hint at other reasons why the question would benefit the GOP?
The new information sort of supports that. I mean, basically, the idea is that if you're asking for a citizenship from respondents that they are going to fear filling it out, even if they are here legally or they are in fact a citizen. If they've got relatives who are not, or if they've got people in their household who are not, that they're going to fear filling it out, and therefore there's going to be an undercount. And it happens that Hispanics tend to be in places that tend to vote more Democrat, and that's why this study sort of outlines what people have been talking about, what opponents of the question have claimed is the point of all of this. The Trump administration has denied that and said this is not a partisan thing and that they're trying to help enforce the Voting Rights Act.
Has anybody done any studies about how much it would depress the Hispanic turnout and what the impact might be? Obviously, border states like a Texas or a southern state like Florida, it might impact a lot, but it could impact states like New York as well.
Correct. And it can impact places that are also Republican places, for example, Texas. Now, there was a study a few weeks ago that estimated that about 4 million Hispanics would be undercounted, but I've seen other studies that show even more people would be undercounted.
What if the question makes it onto the census and nobody answers it, or at least the people who are sympathetic to Hispanic and immigrant issues decline to answer it?
That could happen. I don't know what the outcome would be. I mean, it really depends on how many people are not filling out the form. I think it's less about not answering that question. It's more about not filling the form out at all. And that could have a big impact because that affects redistricting, it affects apportionment. It causes, the federal government funding to go disproportionately to places that, don't jibe with how many people there actually are. If you miscount the population, then you've got 10 years of bad data that you're basing these decisions on funding and congressional apportionment and redistricting on.
Finally, Tara, we know that the House has already moved to hold Commerce Secretary Ross and AG Barr in contempt for their refusal to cooperate on this question. Do we know if the Supreme Court ruling will impact that, and what are Democrats trying to learn or at least show to the public by calling those two?
Well, I mean, there are layers and layers of this, and as they get peeled away, there's more and more evidence coming out that these discussions were going on earlier than the officials had originally said. So the Supreme Court decision can go ahead and happen, and it is projected that, based on oral argument and based on the 5-4 conservative majority, that it is not going to be surprising if they do rule in favor of the question staying on the form. But the congressional subpoenas can go ahead. Now, they have been blocked, and President Trump invoked executive privilege to stop the information going to the House Democrats. However, those subpoenas and those actions by Congress can certainly continue, as can the lower court activity. It's just a matter of if these go to the printer in July with the question on it based on a Supreme Court decision, what happens if there are further rulings against it, and can these be reprinted again? And that's a little bit up in the air.
Tara Bahrampour is a Washington Post reporter on aging, generations, and demography. Thank you so much for clearing up a very confusing issue. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, Kim Kardashian took up her cause. Then President Trump commuted Alice Johnson's sentence for drug trafficking. Johnson is now free. She wrote a book about her experiences. Johnson joins RFL after the break.